The forest was a place of shadows and secrets, and for Sage, it was the only place that ever felt like home. This was the territory of the Night Howler pack, a vast expanse of ancient trees and whispering winds, but for Sage it was a gilded cage. She lived on the very edges of the pack lands, in a small drafty cottage that was more of a storage shed than a home. She was an orphan, taken in by the pack out of a sense of duty but never out of love. From the moment she could walk she was reminded of her place, the bottom. The other children, and later the teenagers, never let her forget that she was different. While they began to feel the stirrings of their inner wolves around their 10th birthday, Sage felt nothing. Years passed and she remained, just Sage. Just a girl. No heightened senses, no super strength, no ability to shift. The pack called her a late bloomer at first, but the term soon turned into something crueler, wolfless. They whispered it behind her back and sometimes right to her face. The one who whispered it the loudest was Brock, the son of Alpha Thorin. Brock was everything a future alpha was supposed to be, strong, loud, and confident to the point of arrogance. When they were children he had been tasked with including her in games, a duty he resented. As they grew older that resentment turned into open contempt. He never missed a chance to shove her, to trip her, or to make a joke at her expense. And because he was the alpha's son, the rest of the pack followed his lead. Sage learned to be quiet, to be small, to make herself invisible. She spent her days doing chores for the pack, mending clothes, tending to the vegetable gardens, cleaning the great hall after feasts. It was honest work, but it was work that marked her as a servant, not a member. But today was different. Today was the mate ceremony, the most important day in a young wolf's life. On this night, under the light of the rising moon, all the unmated wolves of a certain age would gather in the sacred circle. It was a night of magic, where the ancient bonds of the pack would guide each wolf to their destined partner, their true mate. It was a night for promises and new beginnings. For Sage it was her last chance. If she found her mate tonight, all the years of loneliness and pain would fade away. She would have a place. She would belong to someone. She had spent the morning by the creek, washing her only decent dress, a simple blue linen shift. She scrubbed it until her knuckles were raw, trying to wash away the faint scent of earth and solitude that seemed to cling to her. She knew, in a way she couldn't quite explain, that her life depended on this ceremony. If no one chose her she would be cast out. The pack had no room for the weak, and a wolfless, mateless female was the weakest link of all. As the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground, the pack started to gather in the clearing. A great bonfire roared in the center, its flames licking at the darkening sky. The air crackled with excitement and nervous energy. Young men puffed out their chests, trying to look strong and capable. Young women brushed their hair and laughed a little too loudly, their eyes scanning the crowd. Sage stood at the very edge of the gathering, half hidden by the trunk of a large oak tree. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Alpha Thorin, a large man with a grizzled beard and eyes that missed nothing, stepped onto a raised wooden platform. The crowd fell silent. Tonight, his voice boomed, echoing through the clearing, we honor the old ways. The moon will guide you. The bond will find you. Step into the circle with an open heart, and trust in the magic of our people. One by one, the young wolves stepped forward into the wide circle of torchlight. Sage took a deep, shuddering breath and forced her feet to move. She felt every pair of eyes on her as she walked to the far side of the circle. She could feel Brock's gaze most of all, hot and mocking. He stood confidently in the center, knowing that as the Alpha's son, he would have his pick. There had been whispers, promises from his father, that he was to choose Sage. It was a political move, a way to tie the orphan girl to the Alpha's family and ensure her loyalty. But the look in Brock's eyes was not one of promise. It was one of impending victory, of claiming a prize he did not want but was obligated to take. The ceremony began. The pack's shaman, an old woman named Anya, began a low, chanting song. The wolves in the circle started to move, walking slowly around each other. This was the moment. This was when the pull of the mate bond was supposed to take over, guiding each person to their other half. Sage closed her eyes, praying to the moon goddess for a sign, for any feeling at all. She felt a nudge. A warm, hopeful feeling bloomed in her chest. She opened her eyes to see a kind-faced young man named Finn standing before her. He was a quiet boy, a guardian of the borders, and he had always been gentle with her. For a breathtaking second, Sage thought it was happening. She felt a flicker of connection. But then, a large hand clamped down on Finn's shoulder and shoved him aside. It was Brock. Brock stood in front of her, his expression a mask of disgust, as if he'd been forced to touch something rotten. The hopeful feeling in Sage's chest vanished, replaced by a cold dread. The chanting stopped. The entire pack watched, holding its breath. "Sage," Brock said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He didn't just say her name, he spat it out. "I cannot do this. I cannot pretend that the moon goddess would ever bond a future alpha to nothing." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. A few people gasped. Sage felt the world tilt. This wasn't just rejection. This was a public execution of her hopes. "I reject you," Brock continued, his voice growing stronger, feeding off the shock of the crowd. "You have no wolf. You have no scent of a mate. You are a blank space. To bind myself to you would be to weaken our pack. It would be an insult to our bloodline." Tears welled in Sage's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood her ground, her knees trembling so violently she was sure they would buckle. Alpha Thorin stepped forward, his face stern and unreadable. "Brock speaks with the harsh truth of an alpha," he said, his voice cold. "The mate ceremony has revealed what we have long suspected. Sage, you are not one of us. The bond does not recognize you. A pack cannot carry dead weight." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not malice but a cold, hard practicality. It was almost worse. "You are hereby banished from the lands of the Night Howler pack. You have until sunrise to gather your things and leave. If you are found on our territory after that, you will be shown no mercy." Banished. The word echoed in her mind. It was a death sentence. The forests beyond their territory were wild and filled with dangers, from rogue wolves to other darker creatures that hunted in the night. A human, a girl alone would not survive a week. Sage didn't remember leaving the circle. She didn't remember the stares, the pitying looks from some, the smug satisfaction from others. She only remembered running. Her feet carried her away from the firelight, away from the whispers, away from the only life she had ever known. She stumbled through the dark woods, branches scratching her arms and face, her tears finally falling freely. The cold night air bit into her skin, but the cold inside her was far, far worse. She was alone. She was nobody. And she was as good as dead. The darkness of the forest swallowed her whole, and for the first time, the shadows that had once been her comfort felt like a tomb. The cold was the first thing that truly registered, a deep, aching cold that seeped through Sage's thin dress and settled into her bones. It was a cold that felt final, as if the warmth would never return. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave way, collapsing not in a dramatic heap, but in a slow, graceless slide against the rough bark of a giant, ancient tree. The sounds of the Night Howler pack were gone, replaced by an eerie, profound silence broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures and the mournful sigh of the wind through the pine needles high above. This was the unclaimed forest, a place spoken of in hushed, fearful tones by her pack. It was a lawless land, a buffer zone between territories, where no alpha's rule held sway and only the most desperate or dangerous creatures dared to roam. And now she was one of them. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a futile attempt to conserve what little body heat she had. The tears had stopped, not because the pain was gone, but because a strange, hollow numbness had taken its place. It was as if the shock of the rejection and banishment had built a wall inside her, blocking out the crashing waves of emotion. All that was left was the cold and a terrifying emptiness. What was she supposed to do now? Where could she possibly go? She had no food, no weapon, no survival skills beyond tending a garden and mending a fence. The reality of her situation pressed down on her, heavier than any physical weight. The darkness around her was not just the absence of light, it was the absence of hope. Hours seemed to pass. The moon, a cold, sharp sliver in the sky, offered little light and no comfort. It was the same moon that had witnessed her humiliation. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She was prey and she knew it. Eventually, a more immediate need pushed through the fear: thirst. Her throat was raw from crying and running. Forcing her stiff limbs to move, she began to crawl, then walk, following the slight downward slope of the land, hoping it would lead to water. Her ears, still frustratingly human, strained for the sound of a stream. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the undergrowth, she heard it, a faint, gentle gurgling. Pushing aside a thick curtain of ferns, she found a small, clear creek cutting through a rocky bed. She fell to her knees and drank greedily, the icy water a shock to her system but a relief to her parched throat. It was then that she saw it, a little further upstream, a dark opening in a moss-covered rock face. A cave. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was a place to hide. The cave was shallow and damp, but it was out of the wind. She curled up in the farthest, darkest corner, pulling a few dry leaves over her legs for scant insulation. This was her new home, a cold, stone hole. As she shivered in the dark, a strange thing began to happen. The numbness started to fade, and in its place, a faint, unfamiliar warmth began to bloom in the very center of her chest. It was a delicate sensation, like a single ember glowing in a vast, dark fireplace. At first she thought it was just her body fighting the cold, a last desperate attempt to stay alive. But it felt different. It felt external. As if a tiny, invisible thread was tied to her heart, and someone, somewhere, was giving it a gentle, curious tug. She was too exhausted and frightened to question it. She simply clung to the feeling, the first non-terrifying sensation she had felt since the ceremony began. It was a mystery, but for now, it was her mystery, a small secret warmth in the immense cold. At that exact moment, many miles away, in a grand stone palace that stood as the heart of the wolf kingdoms, Alpha King Griffin was trying to focus on a map. His war council was gathered around a heavy oak table, discussing border disputes and trade routes. Griffin, a man whose very presence commanded silence and respect, was usually the most focused in the room. But tonight his mind was wandering. A restlessness had settled in his bones, a feeling he couldn't name. He was a powerful alpha in the prime of his life, yet a deep loneliness was a constant, quiet companion in his lavish chambers and crowded halls. He had waited his entire life for his true mate, for the one person who would complete his soul and rule beside him. Years had passed, and he had begun to fear that the moon goddess had forgotten him. Then it hit him. It was not a sound or a sight but a scent. It flooded his senses so powerfully that he physically staggered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. Wildflowers after a spring rain. Sun-warmed earth. And underneath it all, a heartbreaking note of sorrow and fear. It was the most beautiful, most compelling thing he had ever smelled. It was the scent of his mate. His beta, a steady and loyal wolf named Marcus, saw the change instantly. "My king? What is it?" Griffin didn't answer with words. A low, primal growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that made every warrior in the room take a step back. His eyes, usually a calm, commanding gray, now swirled with the gold of his wolf. "She's here," he breathed, the words barely a whisper, yet they filled the room. "My mate. She's in trouble. She's afraid." Without another word, he turned from the table, his royal cloak swirling behind him. He didn't head for the palace doors. He ran for the balcony that overlooked the vast forests. As he ran, his form began to blur and shift. It was not a slow, painful transformation, but a swift, powerful explosion of energy. Clothes tore and fell away as his body expanded, muscles rippling and reforming. In the space of a few heartbeats, where the Alpha King had stood, was now a colossal wolf. His fur was the color of charcoal and shadow, thick and lustrous. He was immense, larger than any ordinary wolf, a living embodiment of power and royalty. This was his true form, the form he only took when the situation was dire or the call was absolute. He leaped from the balcony, landing silently on the soft earth far below, and then he was running. He moved with a speed that was unnatural, a blur of darkness streaking through the trees. The forest, which would have been a tangled maze to any other creature, was an open road to him. He was following the scent, that invisible thread that was pulling him forward with an urgency that bordered on madness. His wolf mind was singular in its focus: find her. Protect her. The scent grew stronger with every passing second, leading him deeper into the unclaimed lands. He could feel her fear now, a sharp, bitter tang mixed with the sweetness of her essence. It fueled his speed, a protective fury rising within him. Who had dared to make his mate feel this way? Who had left her alone and terrified in the wilderness? Back in the cave, Sage had drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep. The strange warmth in her chest had grown slightly, becoming a steady, comforting pulse. In her dreams she wasn't alone. She felt a presence, large and powerful but somehow safe. She saw flashes of dark fur and kind, intelligent eyes the color of storm clouds. She felt the ghost of a promise, a sense of belonging so strong it made her heart ache. It was a dream more real than any she had ever had. A sound jolted her awake. It was the sound of a large animal moving just outside the cave entrance. The fragile piece of her dream shattered, replaced by sheer ice-cold terror. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the cold stone wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. This was it. This was how it would end. Torn apart by some wild beast in the dark. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the end. But the attack didn't come. Instead, a soft huff of air, a warm breath, drifted into the cave. Slowly, trembling so hard her teeth chattered, Sage opened her eyes. Silhouetted against the slightly less dark mouth of the cave was the head of a wolf. But it was a wolf like none she had ever seen. It was enormous, its head nearly brushing the top of the cave entrance. Its eyes glowed with a soft, intelligent light, and they were fixed directly on her. She should have screamed. She should have frozen in absolute panic. But the warmth in her chest suddenly flared, becoming a blazing, undeniable heat. It was reaching out for this creature. This wolf. And the fear, while still present, was now mixed with something else, something impossible, a profound, deep-seated recognition. She was looking into the eyes of the beast, and instead of seeing death, she saw a reflection of the warmth she felt inside. She saw a home she had never known. She didn't know who or what this was, but the instinct that had kept her alive for so long told her one thing with absolute certainty: she was safe. The world had shrunk to the space between Sage's terrified heartbeat and the wolf's calm, steady gaze. She remained pressed against the cold stone of the cave wall, her mind screaming at her to run, to hide, to do anything but sit there frozen. Yet her body would not obey. The strange, warm feeling in her chest was like an anchor, holding her in place, whispering a language older than fear directly into her soul. It was a feeling of rightness, a sense of connection so profound it overrode every instinct for self-preservation. The wolf was immense, a creature of myth and shadow, but the glow in its eyes was not one of hunger. It was curiosity. It was recognition. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, the great wolf lowered its head. It was a gesture of submission, of non-aggression, something a beast of its size and power should not have needed to display to a helpless girl in a cave. It took a single silent step forward, then another, its movements fluid and controlled. The cave, which had felt so large and empty moments before, now seemed incredibly small, filled with the presence of the animal and the scent of pine forest and cold, clean night air. Sage held her breath as the wolf stopped just a few feet from her. It simply looked at her, its intelligent eyes studying her face, her trembling hands, the tear tracks that had dried on her cheeks. Then the air in the cave began to shimmer. It was a sight Sage had only ever witnessed from a distance, always with a pang of bitter envy. The wolf's form seemed to dissolve into a swirl of dark mist and golden light. There was no sound of cracking bones, no cry of pain, just a silent, magical transformation. The massive wolf receded, and in its place, kneeling on the cave floor, was a man. He was tall and powerfully built even on his knees. His hair was the same dark charcoal as the wolf's fur, and his eyes, now human, retained that same stormy gray intensity, but the gold had faded to a soft warmth. He was, without a doubt, the most formidable and handsome man Sage had ever seen. He did not move toward her. He stayed where he was, giving her space. His voice when he spoke was low and gentle, a stark contrast to the commanding roar she had imagined for such a kingly figure. "You are safe," he said, and the words were not an empty promise but a simple statement of fact. "My name is Griffin. I am the Alpha of the Blood Moon Pack. I will not harm you." Sage could only stare, her mind struggling to catch up. An alpha. Here. In her miserable little cave. The stories about the Blood Moon Pack were legendary. They were the strongest, most feared pack in all the kingdoms, their alpha a king among wolves. And he was kneeling before her. The warmth in her chest pulsed in response to his proximity, a physical reaction that was both thrilling and confusing. "Can you tell me your name?" Griffin asked, his voice still soft as if speaking to a frightened animal. It took Sage 2 tries to find her voice, which came out as a dry croak. "Sage. Sage," he repeated, and her name on his lips sounded like a precious thing. "What are you doing out here alone? Where is your pack?" The question, asked with such genuine concern, broke the last of her composure. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes, but these were not the tears of panic, they were tears of shame and relief. The whole story came tumbling out in a choked, broken whisper. The years of being an outsider, the hope of the mate ceremony, Brock's cruel rejection, Alpha Thorn's cold banishment. She told him everything, unable to stop the flow of words once it had started. Griffin listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word, a storm gathering in his gray eyes. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he slowly reached out a hand, not to touch her, but to offer it. "You will never be treated that way again," he said, and his voice held the absolute authority of a king. "You are coming with me. You are under my protection now. Hesitantly, her small, cold hand trembling, she placed hers in his. His grip was firm and warm, engulfing hers completely. As he helped her to her feet, a jolt, like a spark of lightning, passed between their palms. It was the warmth in her chest made physical, a confirmation of the invisible thread that had drawn him to her. He felt it too. She saw the shock in his eyes, quickly masked by a deeper, more unreadable emotion. The journey to his palace was a blur. Griffin, respecting her modesty and shock, shifted back into his wolf form. He was even more magnificent in the moonlight, a giant, living shadow. He knelt again, a clear invitation. With a heart pounding against her ribs, Sage carefully climbed onto his back, burying her hands in the thick, surprisingly soft fur at his shoulders. Then they were moving. The world became a streak of darkness and silver as he ran with impossible speed. The wind whipped through her hair, but she felt no fear. Cradled against his strong back, surrounded by his scent and the steady rhythm of his powerful muscles, she felt a safety she had never known. She was too exhausted to question it anymore. She simply held on, and for the first time since her banishment she allowed her eyes to close, not in terror but in weary trust. When she opened them again they were standing before the Blood Moon Palace. It was not a crude fortress of wood and stone like the Night Howler's stronghold. This was a true palace, built of pale, smooth stone that gleamed in the starlight, with tall towers and graceful arches. Guards stood at attention at the massive gates, their eyes widening in undisguised shock as their king approached with a ragged, unknown girl on his back. Griffin shifted the moment they were inside the inner courtyard, catching Sage as she slid from his back, her legs still weak. He did not set her down, but instead swept her into his arms, carrying her as if she weighed nothing. He ignored the stunned stares of his pack members, his focus entirely on her. He carried her through hallways lined with tapestries, past rooms filled with curious faces, straight to a set of large, carved wooden doors. He pushed them open to reveal a chamber that took Sage's breath away. It was larger than the entire cottage she had lived in. A large bed with soft-looking blankets and pillows stood against one wall. A fire crackled warmly in a grand fireplace, and through an arched doorway she could see a bathing chamber with a deep, stone tub. The windows were not open holes in the wall, but real glass, looking out over the moonlit kingdom. "This will be your room," Griffin said, finally setting her gently on her feet. "No one will enter without your permission. You may lock the door if it makes you feel safer." He gestured to a pull cord by the fireplace. "Ring this bell and a servant will bring you anything you need. Food, clothes, anything." Just then, the doors opened and a man with a serious but kind face entered. He was almost as tall as Griffin, with the bearing of a warrior. This was Marcus the Beta. He glanced at Sage with open curiosity but no hostility. "Marcus, this is Sage," Griffin said, his tone leaving no room for questions. "She is under my personal protection. See to it that she has everything she requires. And find her something suitable to wear." Marcus simply nodded. "It will be done, my king." Griffin turned back to Sage. The intensity in his eyes softened. "Rest. You are safe here. This is your home now." He didn't wait for a reply. He and Marcus left, closing the doors softly behind them, leaving Sage alone in the silent, opulent room. She stood there for a long time, simply breathing. The warmth of the fire seeped into her skin, but it was nothing compared to the warmth still glowing in her chest, a quiet, steady ember that had been ignited the moment she had met Griffin's eyes in the cave. She was in the palace of the most powerful alpha in the land. She had a soft bed, a locked door, and the promise of food. But more than any of that, she had the memory of a king's gentle voice and the unshakable feeling that her life, which had ended just hours before, had somehow, impossibly, just begun. The first few days in the Blood Moon Palace passed in a surreal, dreamlike haze. Sage spent most of her time in the sanctuary of her room, afraid to venture out. The sheer scale of the palace was daunting, and the curious, often suspicious glances of the pack members she glimpsed in the hallways made her feel like an exotic, unwelcome insect under a microscope. Servants, directed by the stern but efficient Beta Marcus, brought her trays of delicious food, roasted meats, fresh bread, sweet fruits, more than she had ever seen in one place. They also brought armfuls of beautiful dresses, soft and finely made, a world away from her simple, worn-out shift. Yet the luxury felt like a gilded cage. She was a secret, a mystery, and the pack was buzzing with questions. Who was this weak, human-like girl the king had brought from the wilderness? Why was she given a chamber fit for a royal guest? Whispers followed her every time she dared to walk to the gardens for a breath of air. They called her the King's Stray, and the Wolfless Wonder. The worst of the whispers came from a warrior named Rourke. He was a mountain of a man, with a scar cutting across his brow and a permanent sneer on his lips. He made no effort to hide his contempt, believing Sage's presence was an insult to the pack's strength. Griffin, however, was a constant, reassuring presence. He visited her every day, often joining her for the evening meal in her chambers. At first, their conversations were careful and polite. He asked about her life with the Night Howlers, his jaw tightening whenever she mentioned Brock or the rejection. She, in turn, asked timid questions about his kingdom. He spoke of his responsibilities with a weight she could sense, a loneliness that mirrored her own. With each passing day, the invisible thread between them grew stronger. Sage found herself looking forward to his visits, to the sound of his footsteps in the hall. The warmth in her chest bloomed whenever he was near, a feeling that was becoming less strange and more like the most natural thing in the world. She was starting to care for this powerful, kind king, and the thought terrified her. What could she possibly offer him? One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Griffin convinced her to join him for a walk in the royal gardens. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and for a little while Sage almost felt normal. They walked along a path lined with fragrant flowering bushes, talking quietly. But their moment of peace was shattered by the arrival of Rourke and two of his cronies. The large warrior blocked their path, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "My king," Rourke said, his voice a low rumble. He gave a slight, disrespectful nod, his eyes never leaving Sage. "I must speak plainly. The pack is restless. We are the strongest kingdom and our king is the mightiest of us all. Yet he parades this creature before us." He gestured dismissively at Sage. "She has no scent of a wolf. She has no strength. She is a vulnerability. Why does she deserve your protection? What is she to you?" Griffin's entire body went still. The air around him grew cold and heavy with the promise of violence. "You overstep your rank, Rourke," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is under my protection. That is all you need to know. Now step aside." But Rourke, emboldened by the support of his friends and his own convictions, stood his ground. "I will not. A king must think of his pack. If you will not prove her worth, then I will." In a flash he shifted. Not fully but enough. His hands became clawed, his face elongated into a snarling muzzle, and he lunged not at Griffin but directly at Sage. It was a test. A cruel, public test designed to humiliate her and force Griffin's hand. Time seemed to slow down. Sage saw the claws coming toward her face. She saw the fury on Griffin's face as he moved to intercept. But a deeper, more primal instinct erupted within her. It was the same instinct that had flared in the cave, but 1,000 times stronger. It was a roaring, protective fury. This brute was threatening her. He was threatening the first person who had ever shown her kindness. He was threatening the man she was coming to love. A power she never knew she possessed exploded out of her. It was not a conscious decision. It was a reaction as natural as breathing. A brilliant, silvery white light burst from her body, so bright it blinded everyone present. There was no pain, only an incredible sensation of release, of finally becoming whole. When the light faded, Sage was gone. In her place stood a wolf of breathtaking beauty. Her fur was the color of freshly fallen snow, shimmering with a faint, otherworldly luminescence as if lit by the moon itself. She was sleek and powerful, not as massive as Griffin's wolf, but radiating an ancient, noble authority that made Rourke's half-shifted form look crude and pathetic. She stood between Griffin and Rourke, a low, resonant growl rumbling in her throat, her eyes, now a brilliant, piercing silver, fixed on her attacker. The garden was utterly silent. Rourke had frozen mid-lunge, his own wolf eyes wide with shock and for the first time genuine fear. The other warriors took several steps back. The entire pack, those who had witnessed the event from windows and pathways, stared in stunned disbelief. Griffin looked at the magnificent silver wolf, and a wave of emotions crashed over him. Shock, pride, and a love so fierce it stole his breath. He had known she was special, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Marcus, who had come running at the commotion, dropped to one knee, his head bowed. "The Moon Wolf," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The legends are true." The title was picked up by others in the crowd, spreading through the pack in hushed, reverent tones. "Moon Wolf? The Moon Wolf has returned." Sage, hearing the whispers, felt a new understanding flood her. Her late blooming, her feeling of being different, it wasn't a curse. It was because her wolf was not an ordinary one. She was a moon wolf, a rare and sacred figure in wolf lore, a symbol of pure power and a direct blessing from the moon goddess. It was a sign of royal destiny. Griffin took a step forward, his own wolf rising to the surface, his eyes glowing with proud gold. He looked at the cowering Rourke. "Does this satisfy your question about her worth, warrior?" he asked, his voice thrumming with power. Rourke quickly shifted back to his human form, bowing his head so low his chin touched his chest. "My king, my lady? Forgive me," he stammered, his arrogance completely shattered. But Griffin wasn't looking at him anymore. His entire world had narrowed to the beautiful silver wolf before him. Sage turned her magnificent head, her silver eyes meeting his. In that gaze there were no more secrets. There was no more fear. There was only the truth of what they were to each other, finally and fully revealed. The orphan was gone. In her place stood a queen. The days that followed Sage's transformation were a whirlwind. The atmosphere in the Blood Moon Palace shifted from one of suspicion and whispers to one of awe and bustling activity. The legend of the Moon Wolf's return spread through the kingdom like wildfire. Elders who had spoken of the myth only as a bedtime story now looked at Sage with tears in their eyes, seeing in her a symbol of hope and a new golden age for their pack. Where once she had been invisible or scorned, she was now met with deep bows and respectful murmurs of "my lady." It was overwhelming, but for the first time in her life, the attention did not feel like a burden. It felt like a homecoming. Her connection with Griffin deepened into something profound and unshakable. Now that the secret was out, they no longer had to hide their growing bond. Their days took on a new, joyful rhythm. In the mornings, after attending to his kingly duties, Griffin would find her, and they would escape the palace walls. Their runs through the forest became their sacred time. The feeling of the wind rushing through her fur, the earth solid and sure beneath her paws, was a freedom Sage had never dreamed possible. She was no longer the clumsy, wolfless girl. She was strength and speed and moonlight. And running beside her was Griffin, a shadow to her light, his powerful presence a constant, comforting anchor. They communicated without words, a simple look or a soft nudge conveying more than any conversation could. They would chase each other through sun-dappled clearings, splash through icy streams, and finally collapse together on a bed of soft moss, their sides heaving, simply enjoying the peace of each other's company. During these quiet moments they talked for hours. Sage shared her deepest fears and her simplest joys from her old life. Griffin spoke of the weight of his crown, the loneliness of leadership, and his own hopes for the future. They were no longer a king and a stray, they were simply Griffin and Sage, two halves of a whole that had finally found each other. The warmth in Sage's chest was now a constant, gentle sun, radiating through her entire being whenever he was near. She saw the same feeling reflected in his stormy gray eyes, which now held a softness reserved only for her. One evening as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Griffin led her to a place she had never seen before. It was a high cliff overlooking the entire kingdom. From this vantage point, they could see the palace glowing in the twilight, the lights of the pack village twinkling like fallen stars, and the vast, dark expanse of the forest stretching out to the horizon. The full moon, huge and luminous, was just beginning to rise, its silvery light bathing everything in a magical glow. They stood there together in their human forms, side by side, watching the world below. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the understanding that had grown between them. Griffin turned to her, taking both of her hands in his. His touch was familiar now, but it still sent a thrill through her. "Sage," he began, his voice low and earnest, filled with an emotion that made her heart beat faster. "Before I found you, my life was a duty. I ruled because I had to. I was strong because my pack needed me to be. But my heart was empty. I had given up on ever finding my true mate." He looked down at their joined hands, then back into her eyes, his gaze so intense it felt like he was seeing into her very soul. "Then I felt your fear in the forest. I followed your scent, and it led me to the most beautiful, strong and kind-hearted person I have ever known. You are not my mate because of the legend or because you are a moon wolf. You are my mate because you are you. You are my other half. You make me a better king and a better man." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Sage. Will you be my queen? Will you rule by my side not just for tonight but for always?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down Sage's face. This was the moment her entire lonely life had been leading to. The rejection, the pain, the fear, it had all been worth it to bring her here to this man under this moon. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "1,000 times yes, Griffin. I love you too." He smiled, a brilliant, heartfelt smile that lit up his entire face. He cupped her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. Then he leaned in and their lips met in a kiss that was both a promise and a beginning. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but one of deep, abiding love and profound relief. It was soft and sweet and tasted of the future. In that kiss, Sage felt the last of her old loneliness shatter and vanish, replaced by a sense of belonging so complete it was as if she had finally come home after a long, long journey. As they parted, foreheads resting together, the moon shone down on them, its light seeming to bless their union. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching their kingdom sleep below. Sage, the rejected orphan, was now Sage, the beloved queen. Her story was no longer one of loss, but of a love that was fierce, true and powerful enough to change her destiny forever. She had started with nothing, but she had ended up with everything, because she had found her true mate, her other half, her king. If you've been swept away by the story of Sage and Griffin, and you want to discover more tales of love, magic and destiny against all odds, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more of these dark fantasy romances to life. Until the next story begins, dear listener.